So hello everyone again, and welcome to the brown bag event of the SCWIST. And today our guest is Dr. Molly. And before we start the event, I'm just gonna share some housekeeping rules with you guys and introduction of our guest today. And sorry. So today's event is about the art of science and policy making that goes hand in hand and together. And Dr. Molly Sung will talk about it to you in a couple of minutes. And before we start the event, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. We would like to take a moment and reflect our connections to the land and thank the traditional guardians of the land, which we at SCWIST Vancouver live and work. Vancouver is on the unceded ancestral and traditional lands of Mexican, Talasi-Vatu, Scalat, and Squamish, and the indigenous people of the Turtle Island. And so some of the housekeeping rules that we need to talk about is like this video is being recorded. So if any one of you is uncomfortable, you can take off, you can stop your camera sharing and everything. So, and we will take an oath that we will keep our mobiles muted and for that purpose ourselves muted while the speaker is talking. And the chat box will be monitored for the questions by moderators and for the question and answer sessions after the presentation of the speaker. And if you don't get the chance to answer your question you can connect us with connect the speaker, and you can email to the SCWIST at the following email. So the agenda of today's event will be like introduction and then presentation by the speaker. And then after presentation, we will have a question and answer sessions from the audience. And after that, we will have closing remarks for 5 minutes. So, okay, let's see. Today's speaker is Dr. Molly Sung. She is a Ph.D. in organic chemistry from University of Toronto with the background of BS in chemistry from UBC, and now currently working as a formulation scientist in Acuitas Therapeutics, which is also here on UBC land. So for the SCWIST events, there are so many other events. I would like to talk like some of the workshops, brown bags, and we have some events at the international forums and communities too. So follow us for that upcoming events on the Eventbrite. There are so many upcoming events that are lined up. As I said, weekly brown bags and whatnot. And the very most exciting and upcoming event would be the science symposium that is going to be at September 15th between 12 to 1 p.m. PDT. So please join us on that event and get registered for that event on the Eventbrite. Okay, now I'm gonna hand over to Dr. Molly, and she's gonna talk about her. She's going to talk about her journey and her views on policymaking and science.
Sure.
Over to you.
Thanks. Sorry, Annie, I think I just got a message saying there's some people in the waiting room trying to get in, so I will let you handle that. Yep. Okay, thank you for the introduction, Annie. So as mentioned, my presentation today is on science and policy making. And before we get too far into this, I want to, why can't I change? There we go. I want to first define what science policy even is. So the classical definition of science policy is policy for science, but it's also science for policy. And my understanding is the majority of us have been through the academic structure in Canada at some point. So the most familiar part of policy for science most of us are familiar with is probably funding and all of the stuff that goes with funding. So, publication requirements and grade requirements and all that, that's policy for science. But it's also institutional and national research priorities and definitely also regulation. So ethics and bioethics, environmental impact, societal impact, and of course, health and safety regulations. science for policy is a little bit broader. Obviously, right now we're dealing with a global pandemic, so public health is on everyone's mind. That's a huge part of science for policy. But it's also public safety and national defense, including cybersecurity, climate and environmental research, technology and quote unquote innovation. And kind of some of the things that are coming up a lot now are AI, autonomous vehicles. That's kind of going to be taking up a larger and larger space in public discourse. Education research, and that includes pedagogy as well as curricula. And of course, urban planning, transportation, infrastructure, all of that requires science. So, pretty much anytime you present science and evidence to back up policy, that's science policy. And at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, Molly, this is literally everything. And that's exactly the point. Science policy touches every part of public policy. And I think that's exactly why more scientists should be getting involved in policy decisions. And before we get a little too far into this, I want to point out that science advocacy, science policy, and politics are all technically separate things. Science communication is also a piece in this. I include that under advocacy. These three things kind of are related to each other, but are technically separate. But I will be touching on a little bit of each of them. So there are a lot of ways to get into science policy. I have somehow managed to dabble in most of them. That may or may not be the most efficient way of doing this. It probably isn't, but I want to highlight the kinds of things that I've tried that have been successful in my journey into science policy. But first, I want to talk about a little bit about my science background. So as mentioned in the introduction, I got my BSc in chemistry here at UBC. I did my senior thesis on dye-sensitized solar cells, and I also had brief research stints in biodegradable polymer research, as well as lipid nanoparticle drug delivery, which happens to be what I do now as well. I then moved to Toronto to pursue my PhD in inorganic chemistry, and the initial focus of my thesis was going to be water splitting, specifically for fuel. At the time, it was one of the most invested in chemical reactions out there, but I very quickly found out how difficult it was, and we pivoted towards carbon dioxide conversion into fuel. So the reason I wanted to point out my research background is just to, I guess, put into context how I approach science policy. All of the research that I've been drawn to in the past has always been topics that I feel like are relevant to society that can help people at large. And that's also how I approach science policy. In 2015, which is the second year of my PhD, I started needing a distraction from all of the failed experiments I was doing in the chemistry lab. And it also happened to be the 2015 federal election in Canada. And what I was noticing was there wasn't a lot of science discussion in platforms and debates, in articles being written at the time. So there's talk about climate change, but nothing that kind of highlighted that they knew what the technologies were, what the options were. And so I pitched to my local chemical institute Canada chapter, the Bridge Party. Unfortunately, no Rhino Party representative in my candidate in my writing, but I sought out answers from all of these people in order to orient both myself and also the people around me who thought of science as an important issue towards answers that they could use to inform their vote. And it did help me decide who to vote for, but it also oriented me towards a political party that I wanted to support further through volunteering, through canvassing, and other ways of campaigning. And so from there, I kind of never looked back. I've been involved in that party since in many different ways, and I'll get into that a little bit as well. So in 2017, that specific political party was going through a federal leadership race. And there were several candidates from across the country, and I chose to support one, and I wanted to volunteer for this candidate. And I made it very clear from the beginning to them that I am a scientist. I think science is very important. I laid out some of the issues that I thought were lacking in their platform. And so when this really great science advocacy group out in Toronto called Evidence for Democracy sent out a pretty similar science policy survey to all the leadership candidates, she reached out to me, and they put me in touch with their policy lead and said, hey, can you help us develop a science policy framework so we can respond to this survey, but also put it towards the campaign at large. So this was one way that I thought it was a really exciting way for me to be able to contribute to a national campaign using my science expertise or my science knowledge. And I think this is a really maybe underrated way that scientists can get involved in policymaking. Around the same time, the Science Minister for Canada, Kirsty Duncan, she commissioned a fundamental science report, and it was released in 2017. It was led by Dr. David Naylor, who was a former president of U of T. And he led a panel of experts that included, by the way, Dr. Martha Piper, who was a former president of UBC and an honorary member of SCWIST, as I understand. They laid out a report. It was a platform. It was a framework that was a multi-year plan to strengthen Canadian research in the long term, and notably involved significant recommendations for substantial increases in funding for the tri-council agencies, so CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC. And there was a groundswell of support for this report amongst academics, scientists, students, postdocs across Canada to support this increase in the science budget, essentially. And I took this opportunity to write a science blog in Science Borealis about how scientists historically and students have been able to pressure governments to make change for, I think, the better. So this is an example of kind of adjacent to science communication that scientists can also be involved in. And I'm happy to say that this campaign to, I guess, pressure the government to invest in science was successful to an extent. There were some pretty big and significant investments in science that year. So the following year was a pretty exciting year for me. First of all, it was the Ontario provincial election, and it was the first time I got to work on a campaign as staff. And I took this opportunity to get in the candidate's ear. I talked to them about science anytime there were science questions or surveys that came around that involved science issues. The candidate came to me, and we got to discuss what parts of the party's platform to highlight, which parts were clearly in support of science. And I got to, of course, push a little bit for a little bit more. But the other exciting thing that happened in 2018 was I got to start the student group at U of T, Toronto Science Policy Network. So it was a group of us, 5 here on screen, that we were all interested in science policy, but there was no opportunity on campus for us to learn more about it, about how to get into it, about what kinds of skills are necessary. So we decided to just fill that gap ourselves. We ended up hosting a series of workshops ranging from, Science Policy 101 to how to write a policy brief. We hosted expert panels on the sex education curriculum, which at the time was a really big deal in Ontario, all the way to climate change. The IPCC report had just been released as well. And we also got to host seminars by people such as Dr. Molly Sung, who was Ontario's latest chief science advisor. And I'm really happy to say that of the 5 of us, I'm at Acuitas. Savani, who's right next to me, I'm the one in yellow. Savani's right next to me. She's just finishing up her PhD. Farah in the middle, she is working now at Evidence for Democracy as a science communicator. Ellen, who's right next to her in the blouse, she is working at NSERC as a policy intern, and Vasha, who's sitting on her own, last I spoke to her, she was working for the Council of Canadian Academies, also as a policy intern. So I'm really proud of the fact that we were able to all kind of gain the skills necessary to enter into the job market in a field that was important to us. In 2019, there was another federal election. A friend of mine was really excited. He decided to seek nomination to run for public office. So in order to do that, in order to run for public office for a major federal party, you have to seek nomination first, and that sometimes is contested. So we put together a science policy platform for him to put onto his website so that party members could look at it and say, you know, this person really cares about science. And if that's important to them, then they can support him by voting, supporting his nomination. His platform included things like implementing the rest of the fundamental science report that honestly didn't get as much attention during that initial campaign. And I'm proud to say that he was nominated to run in his riding, and he's been nominated again this year. And that science policy platform, it's still on his website because that's something that's important to him. And I also want to mention he himself is a scientist. He has a master's in environmental studies and an undergraduate in environmental policy. And I'm really proud of him and the work that we were able to do pushing science to the front. Speaking of pushing science to the front, there was also a national campaign called Vote Science that was launched that year. That was organized by TSPN, but also science policy groups and advocacy groups all across Canada to help voters who care about science push that issue to the forefront of the election. And I'm happy to say that's happening again this year for the federal election. That's happening in a week and a bit. So please check that out if you're interested. And lastly, last year I finished my PhD. Spoiler alert, it wasn't about water splitting at all. But I also started working at Acuitas Therapeutics, working on supporting COVID-19 vaccine research. And I want to come back to Acuitas a little bit later, so I will leave that there. And the other big thing that happened last year that I was really excited to do was I was named to Dr. Mona Niebuhr, the Chief Scientist of Canada's Youth Council. So she put together a group of 20 young people between 18 and 30 all across Canada with different backgrounds, with different expertises to help her shape the future of science in Canada. So we get to advise her on a lot of different things and hoping to make an impact that way. So as you can see, there are a lot of different ways to get into science policy. I talked about what I did. You don't have to do that. In fact, there are many ways to get into science policy. And I'm going to do a bit of an info dump. This is going to be a lot. I will be passing these slides on to the SCWIST folks if you need this list later. But if you're interested in science policy, there are lots of volunteer and learning opportunities across Canada. The one I want to highlight is the Canadian Science Policy Centre and Conference. This is a conference that happens every year in Ottawa. It brings together academics, policymakers, students who are interested in science and the intersection of science and policy. This is a really great opportunity this year because it is online. It was online last year as well. And A, registration is cheaper because it's online. B, you don't have to fly all the way to Ottawa. So this is a really good opportunity, I think, if you're interested in learning about it, to get your feet wet. There are advisory councils for many different governmental bodies and non-governmental bodies. The one I really want to highlight is the Environment and Climate Change Canada is currently recruiting for people aged 18 to 25 for their youth council. So if you fit that criteria, please check it out. And if you're politically leaning, there is a new initiative called the Lex STEM that helps to demystify the process of running for office for people with science backgrounds or engineering or math backgrounds and tech. This was started to kind of address the underrepresentation of STEM trained people in parliament. That's not to say I think that all parliamentarians should be scientists. In fact, I think what I think is that there is an overrepresentation of other professions, and that people with STEM training have a different way of thinking that would be helpful in making policy decisions. I mentioned Vote Science, that's happening again. And of course, I highly encourage you to contact your local riding association or elected official of choice to talk to them about science and offer support in terms of advice or even just getting out there and knocking on doors. If you are a student or maybe not, or if you're affiliated with a university, there are several student groups across Canada. The ones I know of are in Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa, but if that doesn't apply to you, I did write a blog, it's a little bit of a self-promo here, a blog post with my co-founder of TSPN, Farah, about how to start a science policy group on campus. But if that doesn't really apply to you, there are actually two science policy groups in the Lower Mainland. The first one here at the bottom there with the red stars next to them, Co-Factor Conversion Lab and Science Policy and Health Environment Research and Ethics. That one just started. So this is probably a really great opportunity to get involved. And lastly, there are numerous fellowships and internships across Canada and the States. If you are interested in science policy, MyTax is kind of like the flagship one. That's a really big one that will connect candidates or successful candidates with government agencies across Canada, both provincial and federal, for 1 year fellowships to work in the government. Another one I want to highlight down near the bottom is the Library of Parliament internship. That one doesn't require a graduate degree. So if you're interested in the parliamentary process, that's probably a pretty interesting one to do. And lastly, industry is actually a really great way to learn about science policy as well. So I mentioned that I work at Acuitas Therapeutics now. I work in the lab, not on policy, but when I applied and was doing my interview with the company, I asked if there were opportunities to cross-train in regulatory affairs, and the company's been supportive of that. I've been able to look through approval applications and talk to the people here who are in charge of regulatory affairs, and I look forward to continuing learning about that as well. So lastly, science is political. To quote Aristotle, I know it's a little snooty, but we are zoon politikon, which means, and by that he meant we are people of society, animal society. We live in society and are affected by it. The science that we do is affected by external forces, and the science that we do can and should influence decisions and actions and policies. And frankly, if we don't take our seat at this table, somebody else will. And I think it's safe to say that it's demonstrated during this during the COVID-19 global pandemic that those seats are sometimes taken by people who aren't acting on using the best available science. So that's why it's important for scientists to speak up and step up. And lastly, to quote a friend of mine, if a scientist does science in a lab but doesn't tell anyone about it and doesn't do anything with that knowledge gained, are they really doing science? So with that, I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to connect with anyone who is interested and doesn't really know where to start. And yeah, thank you, and welcome any questions anyone has.
Thank you so much, Molly. I think you can stop sharing your slides. Okay, so now if anyone has a question, they can raise their hand or unmute themselves and just ask Molly directly the question.
Yeah, I think I see one hand up.
Yeah, Pooja, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you, and what a phenomenal journey, Molly. It's great. I had a question which probably is more thought-provoking when it comes to the career in science policy. So I know that you've talked about certain paths that you've taken up to be where you are, which is great. Going forward from here, as a science graduate, how do you see yourself? And I'm asking that not from the passion perspective, of course, we're all passionate about that, but from a career point of view, how do you see your career progressing, at the intersection of science and policy? How do you see your growth opportunities there?
Yeah, so in terms of science policy and politics in general, I will continue to be active in the politics sphere. The only door I close ever is, sorry, to academia. So I'm not interested in being in academia, but I'm open to working in politics if something like that ever comes up as an advisor or whatnot. In terms of my current career trajectory, like I said, Acuitas has been really supportive of me learning about regulatory affairs, and I see that as something that I hope to grow in as well, and hopefully contribute to Acuitas going forward. Does that answer the question? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah.
What I meant in general was that, as a scientist, how, like, what could be the growth curve for a person, in the federal departments or in the industry,
okay.
or
Yeah.
because at some point of time, being a policy analyst is fun, but that's not where you want to be for the rest of your life. So,
so I obviously am not in government, so I feel like I probably can't speak to that as well as someone else might. The folks that I know who are policy analysts in government seem to like it, so I haven't heard too many complaints in that sense. Obviously, working in government is very different from working in academia and industry in terms of pace and red tape, I guess. Career trajectories for people who are policy analysts. Sorry.
yeah, no, thank you.
Hi, Annie. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Sure,
Yeah.
Nasrat, go ahead.
Yeah, because my raised hand is not working, so I just jumped in. Okay, so Molly, yeah, that's a very interesting pathway you chose and very successful. So congratulations on that. So I have a few folks who are interested in entering into policy domain. I was wondering that what is the best way to connect them with you?
With me specifically, you can grab my contact information through SCWIST.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm happy to chat with people about that.
Okay. So yeah, there are a few people at UFT.
Okay.
Who discussed maybe that their interest, but they were not sure how to start with. So I think this is a good idea.
I also really encourage them to reach out to the Toronto Science Policy Network. They're still very active. So they would probably be the most available actually to speak to students at U of T. And like I mentioned, there are workshops that they're hosting on how to get into policy and how to get the skills that are required or are helpful for a policy career.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
While we wait for any other question, Molly, you can also, if you want, you can share your LinkedIn in the chat. I can do that for you.
Yes, thank you. I don't use LinkedIn very often, but I will keep an eye on it in the next week or so in case anyone reaches out that way.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so while we wait for any other discussion, so I wanted to ask, like, how was it getting started in the politics, and what do you like about it?
Yeah, so in terms of what it was like first getting started, obviously, when you reach out to talk to campaigns about how to volunteer, the thing that they probably want the most is door knockers. So going door to door and talking to people about issues at the door. That's scary for someone who comes from a science background because we're trained to we need to know everything, but you don't. Like we have to get over that, I guess, mental block of saying, well, I'm not allowed to say I don't know. It's okay to say I don't know. And actually, I think that canvassing door to door has changed my life. I used to be like, I still am an introvert, but it used to be extremely scary for me to talk to strangers. And now I'm presenting to a group of strangers now. But yeah, like you get to meet so many different people, hear from different perspectives, and really get to know what is important to people on the ground. And I think that's something that's missing in a lot of approaches that some scientists have about how to contribute to politics. You know, they think that, oh, you can just jump in and be a candidate, which is fine. But I think it's really beneficial to do this kind of work first and talk to people and get to know what's important to the people around you before you go in and, I guess, what I'm saying is it can feel like very much like people screaming down from an ivory tower unless you go and you talk to people where they are.
That sounds a lot.
And I promise you, it's not that scary. Once you do it a couple times, it's actually very nice. People are, you know, most people are very friendly,
yeah,
and really happy to chat.
Yeah, I agree. So why do you think, like, at this point, like, what is the importance of science communication that plays a part in the politics or the policy making?
So science communication, I want to be very clear, is extremely important, and not everyone is good at it. In fact, there is an entire degree you can get at Laurentian University in. I think we've seen some examples of bad science communication during the COVID pandemic. There aren't enough well-trained science communicators out there, I think, in major media. And it results in people misunderstanding how science works. The biggest example that I can think of is mask wearing. And in COVID, just communicating the principles of uncertainty in science and how science is always evolving as we learn more and how our advice changes over time. And I think that's something that can be communicated a lot better, because if you don't communicate that, it leads to distrust in science and scientists. And I think that's a really big and growing problem actually in the world.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that they're like COVID changes the lives in whole, but it changes the dynamics of science communication itself. It brought the TikTok on the table. It brought all sorts of communication from like which were used basically for just dancing or something, and now the platforms are used for the science communication. So I think that is highlighted the importance of science communication itself, like this whole pandemic thing. Okay, so I think Elizabeth raised her hand. Elizabeth, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Perfect. Hi, Molly.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. I was, from my perspective of policymaking, it takes a lot of time for anything to happen on a government level. How do you keep your drive and your motivation to keep on pushing when you don't know if things are going to change for the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it is frustrating, but I think this comes back to the mindset of if you don't push, someone else will. And if you stop pushing, then that kind of falls off the priority for people who are making, the policy priorities. So it can be filled up by things that are counterproductive. So that's kind of how I approach both policy and politics, is that if you stop pushing, someone else will take up that space, and you will end up probably in a worse space because of it.
Have you had time where you feel like it just drained your whole energy and you had to stop, or did you have a good support system?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of people felt the same way during the pandemic. I really did have to take a step back, especially when I started my job here. I started at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's been, a year of emotionally draining life. So I did take a step back, and I think that's okay, to take a step back sometimes, but also to know that, there are other people working on this, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. If you team up with people, then teamwork makes the dream work.
All right. Thank you very much, Molly.
No worries. Thanks for the question.
Yeah. Can I ask another question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so Molly, my perception is it could be wrong or it could be right, that there are not that many people out there who care the science policy. They are aware of climate change and the stuff like that, but the science policy, they don't care that much. So when you go out for a campaign, so is there a huge part of educating them about science policy, or my perception is wrong? I'm not sure.
Yes and no. So, I mean, there are all kinds of people out there. Some people are a lot more receptive to talking about, for example, I mentioned I have a little bit of a background in solar cells, and people who are really into that, renewable fuels, they'll talk and discuss with you about where the technology is and where you think it should go. But obviously, I have had people at doors who are just not at all receptive, and you can't change everybody's minds, but you can move the needle 1% at a time. And it's not about changing every single person's opinion. It's about moving every community as a whole, moving them towards a more scientifically oriented outlook, I guess. And I do want to say that my experience working in a political party, people are actually very receptive to people with a science background sharing their expertise. And it's about finding the people that will listen and are willing to go to bat for you as well.
Okay, thank you.
Molly, you mentioned about the youth council. I was wondering, what kind of things youth councils work on right now?
Yeah, so because we're so diverse in what our backgrounds are, there has been a few things that have come up that we have been able to help with. So one of the things was we have several people in health sciences who helped put together a little report way before even the media was talking about it, but immunization requirements to get into non-essential businesses. And that was a report that was forwarded to the science advisor and then passed on to people who make those kinds of decisions. We also have a scientist, I'm just going to shout her out now, Justina Mandolia. She's been tracking PPE waste, especially generated through COVID. And she and Dr. Niemer had a sit-down chat to talk about what can be done to alleviate that and what kinds of policies are important around there. And as I mentioned, we are working on something that has the potential to help, set up framework for science in the future.
Great. So one more question that is bothering, it's in my mind, why are you not in the policy right now?
Yeah, timing and opportunity. So I defended my PhD last April. So it was like the second month of the lockdown, or I guess, yeah, near the tail end of the first month. And the opportunity to work at Acuitas came along, and I knew they were working on COVID, and, you know, it's hard to pass up an opportunity like that. And I'm really happy with my decision. I've learned a lot. And like I mentioned, I haven't given up on science policy. It's something that I'm pushing to learn more about while I'm here. And I still have the youth council work that's ongoing. So it's not a door that I've closed. It's just I have now a foot in each.
Sounds good. I'm sure like you'll be a great policy maker.
I do actually have a question, Molly.
Yep.
So if I remember correctly, you did say, and the question is not meant specifically directed to you, I'm just asking in general, that you intend to stay in politics and kind of, steer your career towards that. Scientists, when they are in the policy landscape, they are supposed to be nonpartisan, right? So what's your take on that? And again, like, this is not directed to you. I'm just curious to know what you think about it.
So the work I do at Acuitas is obviously nonpartisan, but as a private citizen, scientists are allowed to have political leanings. We're allowed to have political expression. So even people who work in government, sure that maybe they can't talk about it too publicly, but in their own time, they can go volunteer for whoever they want. And as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, to me, science is political. Your science is going to be used by someone in some way. And I think it's important for us to use our science in a way that is productive, and in a way that we think is right. Again, to harp on the whole, like, we live in a society thing, like, it's, we're people just like everyone else living in a society with everyone else. I don't know. I very much like to push back against people who say science can't be political. I think it very much is. And I see what you're saying about partisanship. I think, again, the science itself can be nonpartisan, but as a human being, you are allowed to be engaged.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually a good take. I never thought of it that way. Yeah.
Molly, I was wondering, like, what do you think, like, is the most important agenda on the science policy at this point? It's just your opinion. You don't.
I mean,
you cannot pinpoint on one, but what are the most important, like, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think the most important issue of our lifetime is climate change. That's, yes, like right now we are dealing with COVID-19, but as the climate changes, as things like deforestation happens, we actually increase our chances of stumbling across another issue like COVID-19, and knock wood, it doesn't happen. But I think we're that's something that everyone should be thinking about all the time.
I totally. I mean, wearing mask is important too, and getting vaccination is right now the survival kind of thing. But yeah, that is also one of the things.
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone has any other questions? So they can unmute.
I want to ask a question about politics.
Sure.
So the elections are just ahead. So is there any place or somewhere we can find that what is the take of those parties on science? Because to read everything is like not easy.
Yeah. I'm going to double check. I have a feeling that the Vote Science folks might be putting something out soon, because the platforms were released. It's a fairly short election in Canada, and platforms are not released right away. So I think it's just taken time for people to collate everything and organize it in a way that makes sense. I don't know if anything like that exists right now, but if you reach out to the vote science people, they might be able to orient you towards something like that. And also, I believe it's Green Pack. As I mentioned, climate change is part of science policy. It's a big part. They always do like 100 debates on climate every time there's a federal election, and I'm sure there's one near you wherever you are. And that maybe that's a good place where you can ask questions to candidates.
Okay.
I think we will just wait for 1 more minute if someone has any question. Otherwise, we will conclude our session.
I also just want to remind everyone who is eligible to vote, you can vote now. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but advanced polls are open.
Okay, Abby raised hand. No, just
No, I'm sorry, I'm not raising my hand. I'm just supporting what Molly just said.
yeah. Thanks, Abby. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Molly, so much. It was great learning for me at least, yeah. And thank you everyone for joining. And as I said, follow us on Eventbrite for the next events. And if you want to have Molly's contact information, I put in the chat her LinkedIn. And if you want to talk to her, you can get in touch with us. I mentioned the email ID in the slides, or you can just connect us on the LinkedIn for the SCWIST, and we can have that also put you in touch with Molly. And if you want slides, Molly has been really nice about that. And she said like she's happy to share the slides too. So feel free to reach out to us or Molly about that. And thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
So tired now.
Annie, you can stop recording.